Expecting a late-night confirmation of a successful hit from his underboss, Alessandro answered the 2:14 a.m. call with practiced calm. What awaited him instead was the trembling voice of a doctor at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, delivering news that would reduce his carefully built empire to ashes. "Mr. Moretti, your ex-wife is in a coma, and we need someone to take your son." The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alessandro Moretti's penthouse overlooking the Chicago skyline. At 34, Alessandro was a man sculpted by violence and draped in Brioni suits. He was the undisputed head of the Moretti syndicate, a ghost to the feds and a nightmare to his enemies. But in the quiet, suffocating hours of the morning, he was just a ghost haunting his own life. It had been exactly 15 months since Alice walked out. He still remembered the exact shade of the grey cashmere sweater she wore the day she handed him the divorce papers. There had been no screaming, no shattered glass, only the hollow, terrifying realization that love wasn't enough to wash the blood from his hands. Alice was a pediatric nurse, a woman who spent her days saving lives. She couldn't sleep next to a man who ended them. The final straw had been a car bomb meant for him that had detonated 3 blocks from their home, rattling the windows and shattering her nervous system. To protect her, to keep her soul intact, Alessandro had done the hardest thing he ever had to do. He signed the papers, transferred $20 million into an offshore trust in her name, and let her disappear into a normal life. He hadn't spoken to her since. He had strictly forbidden his men from tailing her, needing to honor her request for a clean break. Then came the call. When the burner phone on his mahogany desk vibrated, cutting through the silence of the room, Alessandro didn't hesitate. He picked it up, expecting the gruff voice of his lieutenant, Dante. "Moretti," he answered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Mr. Moretti?" The voice on the other end was thin, reedy, and shaking. "This is Dr. Jonathan Weber from the emergency trauma ward at Northwestern Memorial. I know who you are, sir, and I apologize for calling this number, but we found it written on an emergency card stitched into the lining of a patient's purse." Alessandro's blood turned to ice. "Who is the patient?" "Alice Hayes. Sir, she was involved in a severe vehicular collision on Lake Shore Drive. She sustained massive head trauma. She is currently in a medically induced coma to reduce brain swelling." The silence in the penthouse stretched, thick and suffocating. Alessandro's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of his desk, the wood biting into his skin. "I am on my way." "Sir, wait." Dr. Weber's voice spiked with panic. "There's something else. The reason I bypassed standard police protocols to call you, Alice wasn't alone in the vehicle." Alessandro stopped halfway to the door. "What are you talking about?" "She had a passenger in the back seat, sir. A baby boy. He's miraculously unharmed. Just some minor bruising from the car seat straps. But we couldn't find a father listed on any immediate medical records we pulled, and the social workers are about to take him into state custody. The boy, he's about 6 months old. Mr. Moretti." Alessandro stopped breathing. The mathematics slammed into his chest with the force of a freight train. 15 months since the divorce, a 6-month-old baby, 9 months of pregnancy. "My God." "Tell the social workers," Alessandro said, his voice dropping to a lethal, terrifying whisper. that if anyone so much as breathes on that child, I will personally buy your hospital and burn it to the foundation. I will be there in 10 minutes. He hung up, the phone shattering against the marble fireplace. He didn't bother with a coat. He bypassed his security detail, taking the private elevator down to the underground garage. He threw himself into his black Aston Martin, the engine roaring to life like a caged beast sensing blood. The drive through the slick, rain-drenched streets of Chicago was a blur of neon lights and adrenaline. His mind raced, piecing together a puzzle that made his chest ache. Alice had left him while she was pregnant. She had carried his child, birthed his child, and raised him for half a year, all while letting Alessandro believe he was destined to die alone. Anger flared, hot and violent, but it was quickly swallowed by a paralyzing, suffocating fear. Alice was bleeding. Alice was broken. And a son, his son, was sitting in a sterile room surrounded by strangers. He arrived at Northwestern Memorial, abandoning the Aston Martin at the ambulance bay. A security guard opened his mouth to protest, but one look at Alessandro's eyes, dark, hollow, and practically bleeding malice, shut the man up instantly. Dante, who had been alerted by the garage security, was already jogging through the sliding glass doors behind him, accompanied by 4 heavily armed men wearing tailored suits. "Boss," Dante breathed, catching up to him. "What's the play?" "Lock down the floor," Alessandro commanded, not breaking his stride as he marched toward the trauma desk. "No one gets in. No one gets out. I want the best neurosurgeons in the country on a private jet to Chicago right now. Pay them whatever they want. Threaten them if you have to. Just get them here." The pediatric ward was unnervingly bright. Dr. Weber, a balding man in his late 50s, was sweating profusely as he led Alessandro past the nurse's station. 2 armed Moretti enforcers stood like statues at the entrance of the ward, causing the hospital staff to whisper in terrified clusters. "She's in the ICU, Mr. Moretti," Dr. Weber explained nervously, wiping his brow. "Her vitals are stable, but the next 48 hours are critical. As for the child, he's in here." The doctor pushed open the door to room 4B. Alessandro stepped inside, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of a heart monitor and the soft, shuddering breaths of the tiny creature sitting in the reinforced hospital crib. Alessandro approached slowly, as if the floor were littered with landmines. He looked down into the crib. The boy had a shock of dark, messy hair, exactly like Alessandro's. He was clutching a small, blood-spattered plush bear. As Alessandro's shadow fell over the crib, the baby looked up. Alessandro's breath hitched. The boy had Alice's nose, but his eyes were a piercing, stormy grey. They were the exact, undeniable replica of the eyes staring back at Alessandro in the mirror every morning. The eyes of the Moretti bloodline. "Sir, you're the father, doctor," Weber whispered from the doorway. "We ran a rapid blood type cross-check when we pulled your file. He's a match. His name, according to the diaper bag tags, is Leo." "Leo." Alessandro reached out a trembling, heavily scarred hand. He had broken bones with these hands, choked the life out of rival bosses, and signed away millions of dollars. Yet, as he extended a single finger toward the baby, he was terrified he might break him. Leo blinked, reaching out with a tiny, chubby fist and wrapped his fingers tightly around Alessandro's index finger. A tear, hot and unbidden, slipped down the Mafia boss's cheek. It was the first time he had cried since he was 10 years old. "You're safe now," Alessandro whispered in Italian, his voice cracking. "Papà è qui. Nessuno ti farà del male. Daddy is here. No one will hurt you." The tender moment was violently interrupted when the hospital room door slammed open. Dante stood there, his jaw clenched tight, a tablet in his hand. The look on his right-hand man's face made Alessandro's blood freeze. It was the look Dante got when they were going to war. "Boss, we need to talk, now." Alessandro gently uncurled Leo's fingers, signaling for one of his female operatives, a lethal woman named Sofia, who had coincidentally raised 3 kids of her own, to step in and watch the boy. He stepped out into the sterile hallway, his demeanor instantly shifting from a vulnerable father back to a cold-blooded syndicate leader. "Report," Alessandro snapped. "I pulled the police file and the traffic cam footage from Lakeshore Drive," Dante said, handing over the tablet. "The cops are classifying it as a hit and run, exacerbated by the wet roads. They're idiots." Alessandro looked at the footage. It was grainy, but clear enough. Alice's silver Volvo was cruising at a steady speed. Suddenly, a black, untraceable SUV sped up from the blind spot, swerved violently, and executed a flawless textbook PIT maneuver. The SUV intentionally clipped the rear quarter panel of Alice's car, sending it spinning out of control. The Volvo flipped twice before wrapping around a concrete pillar. The black SUV didn't even brake. It sped off into the night. This was no accident. It was an assassination attempt. "Who?" Alessandro's voice was devoid of all emotion, a terrifying calm before an apocalyptic storm. "That's where it gets complicated," Dante grimaced. "We dug into what Alice's been doing for the last year. 6 months ago, she met a guy, a supposedly clean-cut investment banker named Arthur Pendleton. They moved in together 2 months ago in a townhouse in Lincoln Park." Alessandro's jaw locked. The thought of another man playing house with Alice, playing father to his son, made him want to rip someone's throat out. And Dante continued, "Arthur Pendleton isn't clean. He's a high-level money launderer. But he doesn't work for us, boss. He works for the Volkov Bratva. Our intel suggests Arthur skimmed about 4 million off the top of the Russians' accounts. The Bratva found out. They've been cleaning house." "They targeted Alice to get to him?" Alessandro asked, his eyes narrowing. "Worse. We hacked Arthur's personal servers. Alice found out what he was doing last week. She packed her bags and was trying to leave him tonight. She threatened to go to the feds to protect her son. Boss, Arthur gave the Volkovs her route. He sold her out to save his own skin." The silence that followed was deafening. The hospital lights seemed to flicker as the sheer magnitude of Alessandro's rage expanded to fill the hallway. Alice had left him to escape the violence, only to fall directly into the crosshairs of a coward who served his worst enemies. "Dante," Alessandro said softly. It was the tone he used when men were about to die. "Yes, boss. I want the Volkov safe houses burned to the ground. Every single one of them. I want the men in that black SUV found. And I want them brought to the meatpacking district, alive." "And Arthur Pendleton?" Dante asked. Alessandro turned back toward the window of room 4B, looking at the tiny boy who carried his blood, sleeping peacefully oblivious to the monsters circling in the dark. Arthur belongs to me, Alessandro vowed, his eyes dead and unblinking. By the time the sun comes up, he's going to beg me for the mercy of a quick death, and I will deny it. The Fulton Market district of Chicago was a gentrified playground for the rich by day, boasting Michelin-starred restaurants and boutique hotels. But in its shadows, tucked away in the forgotten, rusted alleys near the old train lines, stood an abandoned cold storage warehouse. It was a relic of a bygone era, its concrete floors stained with decades of old blood. Tonight, it would taste fresh blood. Alessandro stood in the center of the freezing, cavernous room, the collar of his wool overcoat turned up against the damp chill. The only light came from a pair of industrial halogen lamps positioned to blind the man kneeling in the center of the floor. Arthur Pendleton was a pathetic sight. Hours ago, he had been a slick, confident financial broker sipping a martini in a Lincoln Park townhouse. Now, his custom Ermenegildo Zegna suit was torn and soaked in puddle water. His designer glasses were shattered, hanging off one ear, and his face was a swollen canvas of purple and red. Dante's men had intercepted him at O'Hare International Airport moments before he could board a red-eye flight to Zurich with a forged passport and a briefcase containing $2 million in untraceable bearer bonds. Dante stood a few feet away, leaning casually against a rusted meat hook, smoking a cigarette. The smoke curled into the cold air, thick and fragrant, masking the metallic scent of fear pouring off Arthur. Alessandro walked forward, his footsteps echoing ominously against the concrete. The sound made Arthur flinch, curling tighter into himself. "Please," Arthur sobbed, spitting blood onto the floor. "Please, Moretti. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know she was yours. If I had known she was your ex-wife, I never would have looked twice at her." Alessandro stopped inches from Arthur. He looked down at the man with eyes as cold and empty as a winter grave. "You think I care that you slept in the same bed as her?" Alessandro's voice was a soft, deadly murmur that echoed in the vast space. "You think my ego is what brought you here. You're a rat, Arthur. But even rats protect their nests. You sold out a woman and an infant child to Yuri Volkov to save your own miserable skin. They were going to kill me," Arthur shrieked, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I skimmed the accounts. The Bratva, they don't negotiate, Moretti. They told me they wanted collateral. They just wanted leverage to make me pay it back. They weren't supposed to crash her car." Alessandro knelt, bringing his face level with the trembling money launderer. He reached out, his leather-gloved hand gently, almost tenderly, grasping Arthur's jaw. The grip tightened with agonizing slowness until Arthur whimpered in pain. "Let me explain something to you, Arthur," Alessandro said, his tone conversational, which only made it more terrifying. "That woman in the car is the only piece of heaven I have ever known. And that baby in the back seat is my blood. You didn't give them leverage. You gave them a target." Arthur's eyes widened in horror. Your baby." The realization hit him like a physical blow. His frantic mind scrambled, trying to find a lifeline in a sea of razor blades. "Wait, Moretti, wait. If the baby is yours, you need me alive," Dante scoffed from the shadows, flicking his cigarette onto the wet floor. "Boss, let me just put a bullet in his head. He's wasting our time." "No, wait," Arthur gasped, struggling against the zip ties, binding his wrists behind his back. "Yuri Volkov, he didn't just want my money. He found out. He has moles in the Chicago PD, guys who scrubbed Alice's background when I moved her in. They dug deep. They found the sealed divorce records. Yuri knew Alice used to be your wife. He knew about the timeline." Alessandro's grip on Arthur's jaw went slack. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Dante stepped forward out of the shadows, his hand resting instinctively on the grip of the Glock 19 holstered at his hip. "Say that again," Alessandro commanded, his voice devoid of all humanity. "Yuri knew," Arthur cried, tears streaming through the grime on his face. "He figured out the kid was yours. He didn't hit Alice to punish me. He hit Alice to distract you. The hit and run on Lakeshore Drive wasn't an assassination attempt on her. It was a distraction so they could snatch the boy." The puzzle pieces snapped together in Alessandro's mind with sickening clarity. The black SUV executing the pit maneuver. The lack of a follow-up shot. They had wanted the car immobilized so they could pull the baby from the wreckage. The only reason they failed was because a passing Chicago Fire Department ambulance had been 2 blocks behind Alice on Lake Shore Drive, arriving on the scene before the Russians could exit their vehicle and grab the child. Volkov wanted the Moretti heir. He wanted the ultimate leverage to force Alessandro to surrender the shipping docks on the south side, a territory the two syndicates had been bleeding over for 3 years. Rage, pure and unadulterated, ignited in Alessandro's veins. It wasn't the hot, chaotic anger of his youth. It was a cold, calculated inferno. Alessandro stood up slowly, smoothing the lapels of his coat. He looked at his Rolex Daytona. 3:45 a.m. "Dante," Alessandro said, not looking away from Arthur. "Yeah, boss. Arthur here is going to give you the exact addresses of every financial front Volkov uses in this city. Every bank manager on his payroll. Every shell company." Alessandro looked down at the weeping man. "And when he is finished." "I'll make it quick, boss," Dante said, pulling a suppressed pistol from his jacket. "No," Alessandro corrected softly, stepping away into the darkness. "Make it hurt. He left my son to die in the rain." As Alessandro walked out into the stormy Chicago night, the muffled, agonizing screams of Arthur Pendleton echoed off the brick walls, a grim lullaby for the war that had just begun. Alessandro pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing his head of security at Northwestern Memorial. Double the guard on the pediatric floor and the ICU. Alessandro barked into the phone as he slid into the driver's seat of his Aston Martin. "Shoot anyone who doesn't have a Moretti pin on their lapel. I don't care if they look like a surgeon, a nurse, or a priest. Volkov is coming for the boy." The intensive care unit at Northwestern Memorial Hospital was no longer a place of healing. It was a heavily fortified bunker. Men in impeccably tailored suits, their jackets concealing high-caliber weapons, guarded every stairwell and exit. The hospital administration had initially threatened to call the police, but Dante had handled it. A quiet conversation with the chief of staff, coupled with a staggering $3 million anonymous transfer to the cardiology wing, ensured absolute silence. The police remained entirely blind to the impenetrable fortress the Moretti syndicate had just erected. Inside room 12, the rhythmic beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor was the only sound keeping Alessandro tethered to sanity. Alice lay motionless in the center of the mechanical bed, looking terrifyingly fragile. Her vibrant blonde hair was matted with dried blood, partially shaved to accommodate the stark white bandages wrapped tightly around her skull. A ventilator tube snaked from her mouth, forcing air into her bruised lungs. Her porcelain skin was heavily marred by jagged purple contusions from the Volvo's shattered windshield. Alessandro sat heavily in a stiff plastic visitor's chair, elbows resting on his knees, his face buried in his hands. He reeked of heavy rain, expensive cologne, and Arthur Pendleton's blood. He felt utterly toxic, a walking poison that seeped into everything pure in the world. Sophia, his deadliest female operative, sat perfectly still in the corner of the dim room, gently rocking a sleeping Leo in her arms. The baby was blissfully ignorant of the sheer violence raging across Chicago because of his existence. Alessandro slowly raised his head, his red-rimmed, stormy eyes locking onto Alice's battered face. 15 months. For over a year, she had carried the heaviest secret imaginable. She had attended ultrasound appointments entirely alone, endured the agonizing hours of labor without his hand to hold, and built a nursery in the shadow of constant, suffocating fear. She had run from the monster she married simply to save their child. "I am so sorry," Alessandro whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking with a raw vulnerability. "I let you go to keep you safe, and I failed you completely." Suddenly, the heavy wooden door to the ICU room clicked open. Alessandro's head snapped up. His hand instantly glided inside his ruined overcoat, wrapping around the cold, textured grip of his Sig Sauer. A doctor strolled in, wearing standard green scrubs, a pristine white coat, and a blue surgical mask that obscured the lower half of his face. A stethoscope hung casually around his neck, and his eyes were glued to a medical iPad. He kept his head bowed as he approached the foot of the bed. "Checking neuro vitals," the doctor mumbled, his voice distinctly flat. Alessandro's predatory instincts screamed like a siren. Something was fundamentally wrong. The man's posture was far too rigid. His shoulders were built like a heavyweight boxer's. As the man stepped fully into the harsh fluorescent light, Alessandro's gaze dropped straight to the floor. Doctors in the ICU wore comfortable running shoes, or clogs. This man was wearing heavy, scuffed black tactical combat boots, time slowed to an agonizing crawl. In the shadowed corner, Sophia caught the lethal shift in her boss's posture. She instinctively pivoted her body, using her own frame to shield the sleeping baby, her free hand slipping seamlessly into her jacket. The fake doctor dropped the iPad. In a blinding blur of motion, his hand shot beneath his white coat, pulling a suppressed Makarov pistol. He wasn't aiming at Alessandro. He was aiming directly at Sophia and the Moretti heir. Before the Russian assassin could fully raise the barrel, Alessandro exploded from his chair. He didn't draw his gun. A stray bullet hitting an oxygen tank would kill them all instantly. Instead, he launched himself across the narrow space like a starving wolf. He slammed his entire body weight into the assassin's chest, driving the massive man backward. The suppressed pistol discharged with a quiet thwip, the bullet tearing harmlessly through the acoustic ceiling tiles. Alessandro drove the Russian into the heavy oak door, slamming him so hard the metal hinges shrieked in protest. He grabbed the thick wrist holding the gun, twisting it outward with a brutal, sickening snap of bone. The assassin grunted in sheer agony, dropping the weapon to the linoleum floor. The Russian threw a wild left hook, catching Alessandro squarely on the jaw. The Mafia boss didn't even blink. He drove his knee viciously upward, shattering the man's ribs, then wrapped his large hands around the assassin's thick throat. With silent, terrifying fury, Alessandro drove the man's skull backward into the solid wood. Once, twice. On the third deafening strike, the assassin's eyes rolled back, and his heavy body slumped to the floor as dead weight. Dante burst into the room a second later, Glock drawn, flanked by 2 armed guards. He bypassed the outer perimeter through the basement laundry chute, Dante swore, kicking the Russian's gun out of reach. Find out exactly how he got the hospital floor plans, Alessandro snarled, furiously straightening his cuffs. Then take his head and send it to Yuri Volkov in a styrofoam cooler. Tell Yuri I am coming for every single thing he loves. As Dante dragged the bleeding assassin out into the hallway, the adrenaline began to drain from Alessandro's veins. He turned back toward the bed. Alice's eyes were open. They were glassy and swimming with heavy sedatives and terror, but she was staring directly at him, taking in the dark bruising on his jaw and the sheer, unfiltered violence radiating from his towering frame. Alice, Alessandro breathed, falling to his knees on the cold floor beside her bed. Please don't try to speak. She blinked slowly. Her trembling hand slid across the crisp sheets, reaching blindly toward him. Alessandro carefully took her freezing hand, pressing it gently to his cheek. Her terrified blue eyes shifted frantically around the room until they landed on Sophia and the small bundle resting in her arms. Tears instantly flooded Alice's eyes. A panicked, choked sound caught in her throat around the heavy breathing tube. He is safe, Alessandro said fiercely, leaning in incredibly close. Leo is absolutely safe. He doesn't have a single scratch on him. I swear it on my life. Alice tightly closed her eyes, a look of profound, earth-shattering relief washing over her broken features, swiftly replaced by a deep, hollow sorrow. Her eyes apologized and pleaded all at once. I kept him from you because of the monsters in the dark. I know, Alessandro whispered, tenderly kissing her bruised knuckles. You were completely right to hide him from my world. He lifted his head, his stormy grey eyes locking intensely onto hers. He was no longer the cold syndicate boss who had wordlessly signed their divorce papers. He was a desperate father who had almost lost his entire universe. But hiding didn't work, Alessandro said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, terrifying certainty. So, I am going to completely change the rules of this city. I am going to systematically dismantle the Volkov Bratva. I will burn my own empire to ashes if I have to, and from that rubble I will build you a fortress that no one can ever breach. Alice stared at him, her mechanical heart monitor picking up a steady, stronger rhythm. Alessandro gestured for Sophia, who gently laid the sleeping Leo in the crook of Alice's uninjured arm. Alice immediately buried her face into the baby's soft, dark hair, her fragile shoulders shaking with silent sobs of pure joy. Alessandro looked down at his reunited family. Let the federal agents investigate. Let the streets of Chicago run red with Bratva blood. The king finally had his queen back, and an heir to fiercely protect. God help anyone who stood in his way. Did Alessandro's ruthless love leave you breathless? If you want more thrilling, pulse-pounding mafia romance stories and shocking twists, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow romance addicts and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a chapter. Ring the notification bell and drop a comment below. Should Alice forgive him or run again? See you next time.